Hey everyone, we're going to take two. We're going live today with basically this focus of neurodivergent affirming care, where we're currently at, what we're yet to learn, unlearn. And I'm going to run this as a bit of a moderator today and have Danni and Kirsten take the lead on a lot of these conversations. I feel like I am very much still learning. I think we all feel like we're still very much learning and unlearning. So I think it'll be a vulnerable chat. I think it'll be a bit of a mix of topics and just an openness to also bring your thoughts, experiences, both personally and professionally. I think that's a really important part to unpack, that as we talk more about this, it does bring us into this space of discomfort and vulnerability at times, both in reflecting maybe the harm we've done in the past, but also in ourselves personally, what we might feel or see in ourselves by learning more about this. So complete I guess permission to log off if it becomes too much, or if it brings up themes that you're not sure about or aren't ready to kind of bring into this. I think it is a really vulnerable space at times, but also full permission to lean in and be accepting that when we know better, we can do better, and we'll just go from there. So I think we can get started. So Danni and Kirsten are both dietitians with Compete in different roles. Kirsten leads the academy and Danni leads all things performance and nutrition in our pathways, particularly in football. So we have lost Instagram, but that'll reconnect. That's fine. So first question from me, I guess, is let's start by defining what neurodivergent means, but also like what it actually entails and includes. And I think it's just kind of have an overarching theme to carry on with that discussion. Feels like a good place to start.
Yeah, and I think rather than delving into specific conditions within neurodivergence, and it might be important just mostly to delve into broadly what that looks like for people. So the way I look at neurodiversity is the range in which we show up in the world as humans, and the way that our brains function and how we interact with our bodies and the environment. So just recognizing that will be different for everyone. And so I think traditional medical model might have looked at people with neurodiversity as potentially something to fix. And so we're looking at things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, synesthesia, and Tourette syndrome, just as some conditions that we are talking about when we're referring to neurodiversity. And so there's lots of other conditions that people might present with, or ways of being, and how they interact with the world. But I think it's important for us not to mention that we're all on a spectrum, but there are many ways at which people show up in the world, and also that the differences in the way that we interact with our bodies and the environment, and that it's quite common for people to have overlapping conditions within neurodiversity as well.
That's great. Do you have anything to add there, Danni?
No, I think you covered it beautifully, Kirst. I think, I guess I always think of it as, everyone is different and everyone's brain works differently anyway. But I guess neurodiversity is a word that somewhat explains how the brain is working, and that, I guess they're what we might consider is typical. People with neurodiversity, I guess their brain functions perhaps a little bit differently. And so they might need different kind of learning environments, or they experience the world differently, essentially. So it's just understanding that so that you can then, I guess, adjust your practice and care to support them.
I love that you mentioned that, for the main reason I think that's a really important part of what we cover today is like, okay, well, with all this in mind that everyone may show up differently, how do we approach care in acknowledging that not everyone's going to be aware of neurodivergence in themselves, or I'm sure there's quite a big rate of underdiagnosis in that area, but also for those who are diagnosed, how do we show up in care in that neurodivergent affirming care model? I'd just love to unpack that, I guess, in engaging in how do we better show up as practitioners.
I think it's really important to first recognize that these aren't deficits that people are experiencing, that we're just, I see the neurodiversity affirming approach is recognizing the differences in perception and interaction with their environments and the body as part of a normal thing, rather than it being, you know, better or, you know, the right way of how we perceive things. So keeping that in mind at the core of how we approach when we're working with people, and adapting our care to support people based on that. And so many people may have neurodiverse traits, and as you mentioned, they might be undiagnosed. And so I think it's also important not to pathologize that as well, and just acknowledge that regardless of whether someone has neurodivergence or not, that we are approaching it with individuality.
Love that. Is there any practice that you've noticed, Danni, or thought about in terms of how we show up better, or things that you've done that you're like, okay, I can definitely do more of that, or I will do that differently next time?
Differently. Yeah, I think it's probably a generational thing as well. But I remember, like, when I first started working in that space, I had to unlearn and retrain my brain quite a lot, because I guess the experience I had growing up with children with neurodivergence, I think the labels that were associated with them were, I guess, not very nice or politically correct. And we would hope we've come a long way in that sense now. But I guess, particularly, I guess, like behavioural challenge, likewise, and showing up in school and things might have been really challenging for them. But the language that was used around that by, I guess, people around me was very different. So I think unlearning that, particularly, like, I guess, for example, like they're naughty or they can't sit still and those kind of things. I think because you've been around that language so long, trying to remove that and actually seeing that as part of their way of functioning and showing up and trying to support regulation. So when they're partaking in those kind of behaviours, it's so that they can feel safe and they can reduce their anxiety. So I guess trying to flip it, and rather than coming from it from a perspective of judgment or something like that, it's actually, okay, well, why are they behaving this way, and how can I support them to feel more safe, less anxious, and to be more regulated, I guess. And then the other piece is, I guess, coming back to that traditional medical model, you might have doctors or even parents feeling that pressure for their kids to say, eat more vegetables. But if they're suffering neurodiversity or managing it, those sensory sensitivities and things can be quite strong and overwhelming. And so is that actually a priority or a goal that we need to work on, or do we just need to unpack that and discuss why you feel that social pressure, and more, I guess, about health and how we can manage things within meeting their needs and not having to, say, force feed them or have stressful family meal times and things like that.
Yeah, great, Danni. There's a couple of key points there I'd love to reiterate, because I think one of the things that you mentioned, Kirst, is like, first of all, it's not good versus bad. And same with you, Danni. I think previous traits were labelled with a morality when it came to neurodivergence. It just is, and it's something we need to listen to and accommodate and validate. But also, I think the other thing, Danni, that you really touched on, and I think as dietitians we need to really reflect on, is our tendency to want to fix. And I think this has been probably something that we've all probably noticed ourselves trying to do. And this isn't about fixing. This is actually meeting them where they're at and accommodating and elevating that behaviour based around all the different things that are happening for them and that they feel able to do. And yeah, I think those 2 points were just worthwhile kind of bringing back to where we need to be. You mentioned a lot about the unlearning. So I know, Kirst, we've reflected on this a little bit as well. Can you talk me through what it's been like in your own unlearnings, or just really working through where your bias is sitting at times from what we were taught and the traditional models of care? Yeah, has that felt conflicting or vulnerable, or has it actually been empowering? Like,
I think all of those things. There's been a lot of learning, like, and I've got to admit, like, the learning in this space for me has been quite recent, and I think it will continue to evolve, because now, as you said recently, like, it's kind of ignited this like interest and passion in me to do better. So unpacking like the ableist views that we bring towards how we're expecting clients. And I mean, historically, I'm trying my best not to do this anymore now I know better, but just trying to show myself kindness, because you know, when I first started practicing, that wasn't something that we necessarily even considered in how we approach dietetic care. And so unfortunately, this might mean in the past that without acknowledging this, we might have perpetuated harm. Which, yeah, I think that we just have to show ourselves some kindness in that, and move forward from it, whilst acknowledging that that is very much potential. And so acknowledging my bias from a place of, you know, I'm a privileged, thin, white person, and from many people's view, I would show up as neurotypical or normal. And so that's something that I'm very aware of in practice, and it's becoming forefront for me to make sure that I'm not implying that bias on other people in the way that I'm practicing with them.
I think that's so key. I think so often, particularly in my supervision sessions with other dietitians, like we do fall into the thing of like, well, it worked for me, or this has been really empowering for me, so I want to give it to you. And if you do this like I did, then this will happen to you. And you know, it happens a lot in disordered eating disorder experience. I think it happens as well in neurodivergent care. And I think it's really important to make sure we take the standpoint of going, I can absolutely be the expert in these, but you are the expert in your life and what you are experiencing. And if we can elevate that, then I am sure we can meet together. But so often we try and override that. And I think, you know, if we look and take, you know, that traditional model of care, like you said, I hear so many things around how that might impact someone's relationship with food, or experience with food. You touched on a little bit, Danni, in terms of the sensory perceptions. Can we chat a little bit about, I guess, as dietitians, what we need to be aware of when it comes to food and how experience might be impacted?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you wanted to speak first, Danni, but I think one of the key components in this particular working in this space is that many people may show up with altered sensory perception and sensitivity. So things like taste, texture, smell, as well as interoception. So how we're experiencing our body from the inside, and exteroception. So how we're interacting with our environment, and how our bodies both receiving cues and also how we communicate with others around us. So I think something we really need to be mindful of in practice is how we approach nutrition care planning, and accommodating and respecting that people may be experiencing things differently. So just because one person might experience texture one way, the next person may not. Even in this, if they might be experiencing a similar condition, may experience that very differently.
Yeah, that's so complex.
And nuanced.
Yeah.
Oh, totally.
I think that's one of the biases you almost have to remove as well as a dietitian, because you're not having the same sensory experience as that person. So you can be, oh yeah, I love strawberries, they're so sweet, and like I like the texture of the seeds or whatever else, but that's not their experience. So you kind of have to remove your view or perception of it and just kind of put it off the table, and just, I guess, be open and listen to them as well. And I think the other piece that I have found from experience with like cooking classes with kids with neurodiversity is when there's a perception that they're going to have to eat a certain food, sometimes that sensory experience just from anxiety is like tenfold more than if it's just us talking about food, or maybe we're playing with food or baking something and there's no pressure to actually then touch or ingest the food. So I think that's a really important thing to maybe flag, because it can change the environment where you're talking to people. So if say a kitchen is really overwhelming for them for multiple reasons, or dining room or whatever, maybe you need to try and remove that, or any kind of posters of food or anything else that might perhaps change that level of anxiety, because it can make it just a little bit trickier to have those conversations and get that understanding of their experience in the environment and the world. But of course, we as dietitians love to talk about food and that experience.
And I can imagine the social piece of the sensory sensitivity is absolutely still relevant too, because
from a communication perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And environment of eating and all those types of things.
So sort of one example I think of is some of the unfortunate scenarios where respectfully as a new grad, I remember sort of interacting with people around like the setup of a meal environment, and now I know more about neurodiversity and how that shows up in people. There's very little chance that I would ask someone to show up in the same way at the dinner table, expecting them to have conversations with family members, for example, which could be really overwhelming. That's just one example. Instead, I'd be more likely to approach it with a lot more empathy and a lot more understanding that meal times are going to look differently for every person.
I love that. Can we talk a bit about executive functioning? Because I feel like this is really part of, it really conflicts or contradicts a lot of what we traditionally prescribe or support in terms of dietetic care. And I just love to talk about what is executive functioning, what do we mean by that, but also how can it impact someone's ability to feed themselves and have an experience with food.
So I think something that I'm still learning a lot more about is executive functioning, but the way that our brains are able to process information to be able to execute tasks and follow instructions and things like that, particularly maybe higher level multi-step instructions might be different for someone
recipes.
That has exactly exactly. I am unable to follow recipes for the most part, just acknowledging that.
That was the first one.
No, I know, but we're showing with kindness, showing up with kindness for ourselves and others. So things that we may have thought might be an easy thing, just do this, might actually be quite challenging for people. For example, meal planning, grocery shopping, as you said, following recipes. So I think that there's, working with people to be able to simplify it for them, or not even simplify, but just becoming in tune with what the client feels is appropriate for them, and not undermining their ability or capacity to be able to do a task. So not oversimplifying, but rather understanding what they feel like they could achieve, or what might actually help them. But without, this gets very layered, I suppose, without assuming their I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but essentially I think that it's just so important to hear what the person is telling you.
Not assuming that they've got an issue with it, or like they find it hard. It's like, no, everyone's going to show up differently. Let's talk about your experience with following a recipe, for example, and then go from there.
And I think another point, this is what I was getting to, is not assuming that people will necessarily know how to communicate how they're feeling, or what they need, or what they want. And I think sometimes that's a really a common thing that I particularly know in practice. I've sort of gone in with the concept of that people will just ask you for the advice that they need, or they'll inherently be able to tell you, oh, I need help with this, or this is what I'm struggling with. People may not be able to identify that.
Such a good point. And I think first, like, straight thoughts go to meal plans. Like, so often we'll have someone coming in and their expectation is they need a meal plan. If you give me this and you tell me what to do, I'll do it. That's all I need from you. And so often we're quite doting. Like, okay, I want to please you, I want to say yes to these things, and we give them what we feel they want or need, but it adds more anxiety, it adds more failure, it adds more overwhelm and friction. Absolutely. So I think I'm really glad you brought that up. Let's talk about that.
Unpack.
So much to unpack, because the more I think about this, the more like I feel like there is a risk of creating trauma when we do interact with neurodivergent people in the realms of nutrition. Like, if we're not listening and we're not showing up to meet them where they're at and really acknowledge, their way of thinking and connecting with the world, like, to think of the trauma we could do in terms of pressuring or not appreciating or respecting their consent or autonomy. I remember an interaction I had with an athlete, and it was just a one-off talk, and she came to me after. This is really what sparked my need to learn more in this space, because she came up to me after and she's like, Alicia, I love this chat. I've had some interactions with dietitians previously, and I am all ADHD, or DHD. So she's autistic and has ADHD. And she's like, I have never felt seen. I really want to improve my nutrition, but I have not been able to find the right person. And my experience has been really negative. And it's actually really impacted my self-confidence with nutrition and how I exist in terms of my relationship with food. And I was like, you know what, I can appreciate and acknowledge the neurodivergent piece of that, but I'm not sure I would be able to meet other people just like her, or have I actually done harm just like that previously, just like this other dietitian has too. And I really had to lean in and go, you know what, I have opened the door to my knowledge around disordered eating disorders. I feel like I can't close that door anymore. I know too much, and it has impacted everything I do in terms of the space of nutrition. But I don't know if I've opened that door yet in terms of neurodivergent affirming care. And I was saying to Kirsten the other day, you know, she was sending me things on Instagram. She's like, this is so not neurodivergent, like affirming, like it's so damaging. And I was like, oh, I feel like you've also opened the door and you can't unsee it. Yeah, you can't unsee the harm or the potential harm. And I feel like this is actually like, you kind of know enough, but it also can lead to a bit of that freeze state of like, I don't want to do any harm. And so I think it's really acknowledging that we will continue to make mistakes. We'll continue to need to unlearn and adapt and listen. And we won't be perfect from the get-go in unlearning this or relearning so many of these concepts. We will be, you know, making mistakes ongoing.
And this is really just a taster, I think, for where we're at with learning as well. There's a lot of concepts that we won't have time to touch on today, but I think that the more we delve into it, the more we're going to uncover, and I can only see it as an enriching part of practice to be able to provide more inclusive care.
100%. It really like brings into that way of like taking time just to collect information is totally okay in this space until you feel like you are confident enough and ready enough to make change. And that's totally valid as well. And so we've spent a lot of time, and Kirsten's led this, and also Danny's been an incredible part of creating this course that we're about to release that is all around neurodivergent affirming care. We've got guest speakers coming in. We appreciate that we are not niche experts in this area, but we have elevated voice in all different areas of this really important topic. And collecting information is one way to then enable us to feel ready to change and adapt. And yeah, as we've mentioned, like once the doors open, you can kind of just appreciate where everyone sits, but also do a whole lot more listening, which is such a core part of what we teach in the academy. So if you'd like to become a member, we'll pop the link into an email, but also you can jump online, message us on Instagram, and we'll absolutely lead you down the garden path of how to access all these. There's a $10 a month option if you just want to access the community and connection side of Academy alongside all the research updates. But there's also a professional membership, which allows that access to courses. We've got more than 30 different modules of a learn at your own speed type of style. And one of those modules soon to be released is the Neurodivergent Affirming Care one.
So exciting.
Yeah, it is really exciting. I'm so proud of what you've created in that space.
Yes.
Awesome.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there's some other amazing courses out there.
Oh my gosh,
and
that
sort of formed the basis of my curiosities in this space. But I'm so excited for this course to come out, and it is providing that baseline, building on what we've talked about today, talking about some key concepts within the neurodiversity space. And it's also accessible for professional development purposes. So it's really exciting.
Really cool. Yeah, I think that's a big thing, right? Like we will never be the one-stop shop of everything. Like we do provide some info on each topic, and then we elevate the other courses that really niche into those areas because there's some incredible people out there doing amazing things. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. It's been so lovely to chat through this really important topic. I hope you've learnt something. Maybe you've lent into some more learning to do. But yeah, if you're not a member of the Academy, please join us because we have some amazing chats, big rants, big debriefs. The community is a very fun place to be. And alongside that, we've got the modules and education resource learning as well. So thank you so much for joining us.